They knelt in the ashes of what used to be their home. 6 children, too hungry to cry, too tired to run, too young to understand why the world had turned its back on them. The oldest, barely 12, held them close, whispering final prayers into a sky that had never once answered. The youngest clutched half a burned doll. The others just stared ahead, silent, hollow. No food, no shelter, and now no more time. They didn't know someone was watching. A man hiding in the trees, rifle in hand, heart clenched with a memory he thought he'd buried forever. Malachi Whitmore had been tracking a wounded deer through the dense brush when he heard them. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on his mind. A sound so fragile it seemed impossible in this harsh land. But as he pushed through the thorny undergrowth, the whispers became clearer. Children's voices here, miles from any settlement. He froze behind a cluster of weathered rocks, his weathered hands gripping his rifle. The sight that greeted him was something that would haunt lesser men. 6 small figures huddled together in what remained of a burned-out cabin, their clothes hanging in tatters, their faces gaunt with hunger. The oldest, a girl with matted hair and fierce eyes, held the others close as they prayed. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 12, suddenly lifted her head. Her gaze swept the treeing with the weariness of someone who had learned that danger always lurked in the shadows. When her eyes found his hiding spot, Malachi felt something crack inside his chest. Those weren't the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, lost too much. For 3 years, Malachi had avoided human contact. 3 years since he'd buried his own family and sworn never to let anyone get close enough to hurt him again. He lived alone on his remote ranch, speaking to no one, trusting no one. The world had taken everything from him once. He wouldn't give it another chance. But as he watched the little boy beside the girl struggled to stay upright, his tiny frame trembling with exhaustion, something inside Malachi began to war with itself. These children were dying right here, right now, while he stood hidden like a coward. The girl's voice cut through the air sharp and defensive. She had spotted him. Her thin arms spread protectively in front of the smaller children, her stance ready for fight or flight, despite her obvious weakness. The way she positioned herself, sacrificing her own safety for theirs, reminded him of someone he'd tried so hard to forget. Malik stepped from behind the rocks, his hands raised to show he meant no harm, but the girl's eyes only grew more suspicious. She'd learned not to trust strangers. In this unforgiven place, kindness was often just cruelty wearing a mask. As he took another step forward, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the valley below. Multiple riders moving fast. The girl heard them too, and the terror that flashed across her face told Malachi everything he needed to know. These children weren't just lost. They were running from something, and whatever it was had just found them. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Malachi watched the girl's face transform from weariness to pure panic. She grabbed the youngest child and began pushing the others toward the back of the ruined cabin, but there was nowhere to run. The walls that had once provided shelter now trapped them like a cage. Malachi made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed over the past 3 years. He moved quickly toward the children, his voice low and urgent, as he approached the girl who clearly led this desperate group. The girl backed away from him, her eyes darting between Malachi and the sound of approaching riders. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. Every muscle in her small body was coiled for an escape that wasn't possible. When she spoke, her voice cracked with exhaustion but remained defiant. "Stay back. We don't need your help." But even as she said it, the youngest boy collapsed behind her. His leg simply gave out, his small body hitting the dirt with a sound that made something twist in Malachi's gut. The child was starving. They all were. Help wasn't something they needed. It was something they would die without. Malachi crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He'd done this before years ago when his own daughter had been frightened by thunderstorms. The memory hit him like a physical blow, but he pushed it down. Not now. Not when these children needed him to be strong. "Those riders," he said quietly, nodding toward the sound that was getting closer by the second. "They're why you're running, aren't they?" The girl's silence was answer enough. Her hand moved protectively to something hidden beneath her tattered dress. Probably the only valuable thing they had left. Whatever it was, someone wanted it badly enough to chase 6 starving children across this wasteland. The sound of hoofbeat tats stopped. Voices drifted up from below, harsh and demanding. Malachi couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. These weren't men who would show mercy to children. He looked at the girl, at the 5 smaller faces that turned to her for protection she couldn't possibly provide. At the little boy who was trying so hard to stand again to be brave for the others. They were going to die here. All of them. Unless he did something that went against everything he'd sworn to himself. The girl must have seen something change in his expression because her defensive stance shifted slightly, not trusting but calculating, weighing her options between a stranger and whatever was coming up that hill. "My ranch is 2 mi north," Malachi said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Food, water, a place to hide." She studied his face with those 2 old eyes searching for the lie she expected to find. When she didn't find it, confusion flickered across her features. In her experience, adults didn't help children like them, not without wanting something in return. The voices below grew closer. Whoever was down there had dismounted and was climbing toward the ruins on foot. Time was running out, and they all knew it. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of every betrayal she'd ever experienced. Malachi didn't have an answer that would satisfy her. He wasn't even sure he had an answer that would satisfy himself. But as he looked at her face, so young yet so determined to protect the others, even as she faced her own death, he saw something that made his chest tighten with recognition. He saw the same fierce love he'd once felt for his own family. The same desperate need to shield the innocent from a world that devoured hope. And he realized that maybe after 3 years of running from his past, he'd found something worth running toward. But before he could say anything else, a shadow fell across the cabin entrance. They were no longer alone. 3 men stepped into the ruined cabin, their boots heavy on the charred floorboards. The leader was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a badge pinned crookedly to his vest. His companions flanked him like predators, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Malachi recognized the type immediately. Men who used their authority as an excuse for cruelty, men who took pleasure in the power they held over those weaker than themselves. The badge meant nothing. It was just another tool for intimidation. The lead man's gaze swept over the children before settling on the girl. When he smiled, it was the kind of expression that made skin crawl. There was hunger in that look, but not for food. Well, look what we found hiding up here like rats in the walls. The girl stepped backward, pulling the younger children behind her, but there was nowhere to go. The men had positioned themselves to block the only exit. They weren't here by chance. They'd been hunting these children with purpose. Malachi remained motionless behind the broken wall where he'd taken cover, his mind racing. He was outnumbered, and these men were armed. But more than that, he could see something in their faces that made his blood run cold. They weren't just looking for the children. They were enjoying this hunt. The leader took another step forward, and Malachi noticed how the man's eyes kept drifting to something the girl was trying to hide. Whatever she carried was valuable enough to justify tracking 6 starving children across dangerous territory. "Come now, Mercy," the man said, his voice mockingly gentle. "You've led us quite a chase, but it's time to come home. Time to give us what belongs to us." So, the girl's name was Mercy, and whatever they wanted from her, she'd rather die than give it up. Malachi could see it in the way she set her jaw and how her thin shoulders squared despite her obvious terror. The man with the badge reached into his coat and pulled out a length of rope not to tie up prisoners. The way he handled it, the way his companions' grins widened, told a different story. These men weren't planning to take the children anywhere. Malachi's hand tightened on his rifle. He'd sworn never to get involved in other people's problems again, sworn never to care enough about anyone to risk his own life. But as he watched the youngest boy cling to Mercy's leg, trembling with fever and exhaustion, he felt something break open inside his chest. The memory came unbidden. His own daughter's small hand in his. The way she'd looked up at him with complete trust that he would always protect her, the trust he'd failed to honor when it mattered most. The leader was moving closer to Mercy now, the rope dangling from his hands like a threat. The other children pressed against her back, their small faces buried in her torn dress. They understood what was coming, even if they couldn't name it. "Last chance, girl," the man said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "Make this easy on yourself and on them." Mercy lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that should have been impossible for someone so young and broken. "No." The man's smile disappeared. "I'll." He nodded to his companions, and they began to spread out, closing off any possible escape route. That's when Malachi realized he'd already made his choice. The moment he'd seen these children praying in the dirt, believing they were about to die, his fate had been sealed. He couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not again. He stepped out from behind the wall, his rifle raised, and everything changed. The 3 men spun toward Malachi, their hands flying to their weapons, but he already had them, covered his rifle, trained on the leader's chest. The advantage was his for now. Let them go. Malachi said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Walk away, and nobody has to die today." The leader's cold eyes assessed him, calculating odds. 2 of his men had their hands on their guns, but none of them were foolish enough to draw against a rifle that was already aimed. "Not yet. This doesn't concern you, stranger," the man said, his badge catching the filtered light. "These children are wanted criminals. They stole something that doesn't belong to them." Malachi kept his rifle steady, but his eyes flicked briefly to Mercy. She was watching him with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite accept that someone was willing to stand between her and these men. The younger children clung to her even tighter, sensing the violence that hung in the air like smoke. What could children possibly steal that's worth hunting them across half the territory? Malachi asked I. The leader's smile returned, but it was uglier now. Ask the girl. Ask her about the map she took from her dead father's things. Ask her what it shows. A map. Malachi's mind raced as pieces fell into place. These weren't lawmen seeking justice. They were treasure hunters using badges as cover, and whatever Mercy's father had found, it was valuable enough to justify murdering children for it. "The map's gone," Mercy said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I burned it." The leader's expression darkened. "You're lying. A clever girl like you wouldn't destroy the only thing keeping you alive." But Malachi could see the truth in Mercy's eyes. She had burned it. She'd chosen to destroy their only bargaining chip rather than let these men have it. It was either the bravest or most foolish thing he'd ever witnessed. The leader must have seen it too, because his hand moved toward his gun. "Then you've just signed your death warrant, girl. All of your death warrants." That's when Malachi faced the impossible choice that would define everything that came next. He could try to negotiate, try to find a peaceful solution that might keep everyone alive. But these men had already decided that the children would die today. Talking wouldn't change that. Or he could act first. Strike hard and fast, knowing that once he pulled that trigger, there would be no going back. He would be committed to this fight, to these children, to a path that would almost certainly end in more bloodshed. If you were Malachi, what would you do? Trust that men who hunt starving children might show mercy, or accept that sometimes violence is the only language evil understands. Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Malachi decided next would determine whether these 6 children lived to see another sunrise. The youngest boy's labored breathing filled the silence. His fever was getting worse, and time was running out in more ways than one. Every second Malachi hesitated was another second these children moved closer to death. The leader's hand inched toward his weapon. His companions were spreading out, trying to get angles on Malachi while staying clear of his rifle's range. They were professionals at this hunting human prey. Malachi thought of his own family, of the moment he'd failed to protect them. He thought of the 3 years he'd spent hiding from the world, letting his guilt consume him while pretending it was wisdom. He thought of the prayers he'd heard these children whisper, their small voices accepting death because no adult in their lives had ever been worth trusting. The leader drew his gun. Malachi made his choice. Malachi's rifle cracked like thunder in the confined space. The leader spun and dropped his weapon, clattering across the charred floorboards. The echo hadn't even faded when the other 2 men went for their guns. But Malachi was already moving. He dove behind a fallen beam as bullets splintered the wood around him. The children screamed, huddling together as gunfire exploded through the ruined cabin. Mercy threw herself over the youngest ones, using her own body as a shield. The second man rushed Malachi's position, thinking to overwhelm him while he reloaded. It was a fatal mistake. Malachi's hunting knife found the man's ribs before he could bring his pistol to bear. The man's eyes went wide with shock, then empty. The third gunman had taken cover behind the doorframe, firing wild shots into the cabin. Wood and stone fragments flew like shrapnel. One of the children cried out. The little boy Malachi had seen collapse earlier. Blood seeped through his already tattered shirt. Rage flooded through Malachi like a poison. These men had been willing to murder children for a piece of paper. They'd tracked them across dangerous territory, let them starve, and now they'd hurt them anyway. The careful control he'd maintained for 3 years cracked completely. He rushed the doorway with a roar that didn't sound entirely human. The third man turned his weapon toward the sound, but Malachi was already inside his guard. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and desperation. The man was younger, stronger, but Malachi fought with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. When it was over, silence fell like a heavy blanket. 3 men lay dead, their blood mixing with the ashes of the burned cabin. Malachi knelt over the last one, his hands shaking as the adrenaline drained from his system. He'd killed before, during the time that came before his self-imposed exile, but never like this. Never with such cold precision, such complete commitment to violence as the only solution. These men had forced his hand, but that didn't make the weight of their deaths any lighter. A small sob broke through his thoughts. The wounded boy was crying, trying to be brave but failing as pain overwhelmed his young courage. Mercy was beside him, her hands pressed against his wound, her face pale with terror. "He's hurt bad," she whispered, looking up at Malachi with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and fear. She'd wanted him to save them, but seeing what salvation looked like had shaken her. Malachi moved to the boy's side gently, pulling Mercy's hands away to examine the wound. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, painful and bleeding heavily, but not fatal if treated quickly. But the fever that had been consuming him was getting worse, and the shock of being shot wasn't helping. "He needs a doctor," Malachi said, though they all knew how impossible that was. The nearest settlement was days away, and the boy didn't have days. Mercy's face crumpled after everything they'd endured. After finally finding someone willing to help them, they were still going to lose one of their own. The youngest children began to cry, understanding that their brother was slipping away from them. That's when they heard the sound that froze Malachi's blood. More hoof-beats. Many more approaching fast from the same direction the first three men had come. Mercy grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. "They always travel in groups," she whispered. These three were just the scouts. Malachi stared at her, the full scope of what they faced finally becoming clear. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now he'd committed himself to protecting 6 children against an army of men who wouldn't stop until they were all dead. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The sound of riders grew closer, and Malachi realized his greatest fears were about to come true. He'd opened his heart again, chosen to care about someone other than himself. And now he was about to watch them all die anyway. At least a dozen riders thundered up the hill toward the cabin. Malachi could see them through the shattered windows. Hard men with weapons and the look of those who killed for money. They'd heard the gunshots and were coming to finish what their advanced scouts had started. Malachi's mind raced through impossible calculations. 6 children, 1 wounded and burning with fever. 3 dead men whose absence would be noticed immediately. A ruined cabin with no back exit and nowhere to run. "Can you carry him?" he asked Mercy, nodding toward the wounded boy. She looked at the child's pale, sweating face and nodded with grim determination. "We've carried each other this far." But even as she said it, Malachi could see the exhaustion in her thin frame. She was starving, had been running for days, and now she was expected to carry a wounded child while fleeing armed men on horseback. It was impossible. They all knew it. The hoof-beats stopped. Voices carried up from below. Angry, urgent commands. Someone had found the tracks leading to the cabin. They had minutes, maybe less. Malachi grabbed the leader's gun from where it had fallen and checked the ammunition. 4 bullets left against a dozen men. The math was brutal and final. "There's a cave system about half a mile north," he said quietly to Mercy. "Natural tunnels that run deep into the mountain. If you can get there." "What about you?" she asked, though her expression said she already knew the answer. Malachi looked at the children clustered around their wounded companion. The youngest was maybe 5 years old, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that would mark her for life. The others weren't much older. They deserved a chance to grow up to find safety somewhere in this harsh world. "Someone has to slow them down," he said simply. Mercy's face hardened. "No, We don't leave people behind. That's not who we are." But even as she spoke with fierce determination, they could hear boots on the rocks outside, heavy, confident steps of men who believed they had cornered their prey. There was no time left for arguments or alternatives. The wounded boy opened his eyes, focusing on Malachi with effort. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Don't let them hurt the others." It was the same thing Malachi's own daughter had asked him in those final moments when he'd been powerless to save her. The same plea that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. But this time, maybe this time, he could keep that promise. A shadow fell across the cabin entrance. Then another. The hunters had arrived, and they were moving with the coordination of men who had done this many times before. Malachi positioned himself behind the overturned table that provided the best cover. His stolen pistol trained on the doorway. Mercy gathered the children behind him. The wounded boy supported between 2 of the older ones. "When the shooting starts," Malachi whispered without taking his eyes off the entrance, "you run straight north to the caves. Don't look back. Don't stop. Don't try to help me, mister." Mercy started. "Promise me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every failure that had brought him to this moment. "Promise me you'll get them out of here." Before she could answer, a voice called out from just outside the cabin. Casual, almost friendly. The tone of a predator who knew his prey was trapped. "We know you're in there. We found our boys and we're not real happy about that, but we're reasonable men. Send out the girl with what we came for, and the rest of you can walk away." Malachi almost laughed at the lie. These men hadn't ridden this far and killed this many people to leave witnesses. But the offer did tell him one thing. They still believed Mercy had the map. They didn't know she'd burned it. "What's it going to be?" the voice continued. "Easy way or hard way?" Malachi looked back at the children one last time. Mercy's eyes met his, and he saw understanding pass between them. She knew what he was about to do. She knew why it was necessary. The wounded boy smiled at him. Actually, smiled despite the pain and fear, as if he wanted Malachi to know that whatever happened next, it was worth it. That's when the first gunman stepped through the doorway, and Malachi discovered exactly how many men he could face before his luck ran out. Malachi's first shot dropped the man in the doorway before he could raise his weapon. His second caught another gunman trying to circle around the side window, but then the cabin erupted in gunfire from multiple directions, and he knew his time was running out. Bullets shredded the air around him. Wood splinters drew blood across his cheek. The overturned table that served as his cover was disintegrating under the assault. Behind him, he could hear Mercy gathering the children, their small voices tight with terror, as they prepared to run. A gunman rushed through the smoke and chaos, thinking to overwhelm Malachi while he reloaded. But Malachi had learned long ago that desperate men fought differently than careful ones. His knife found the man's throat before the attacker could fire. "Now!" Malachi shouted over the gunfire. "Go now!" He heard the scrape of feet on stone, the rustle of fabric as Mercy led the children toward the back opening he'd spotted earlier, barely wide enough for small bodies to squeeze through. The wounded boy whimpered as they carried him, but he didn't cry out. Even in his fever, he understood that silence meant survival. More men poured into the cabin. Malachi's third bullet caught one in the shoulder, spinning him around, but not dropping him. His fourth and final shot went wide as another gunman's bullet grazed his arm, throwing off his aim. The pistol clicked empty. Malachi dropped it and drew his knife, knowing it was over, but determined to buy the children every possible second. A massive man with scarred hands lunged at him, and they crashed into the wall together. They fought with desperate fury, the big man trying to pin him down while his companions closed in. Malachi using every dirty trick he'd learned in 3 decades of hard living. The man was stronger, but Malachi fought with the single-minded purpose of someone who had finally found something worth dying for. Blood ran down Malachi's face from a vicious headbutt. His ribs screamed from the big man's crushing grip, but through the haze of pain and violence, he heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Silence from behind him. The children had made it out. The big man's hands found Malachi's throat. Stars exploded across his vision as his air was cut off. Around them, the other gunmen were moving into position, confident now that their quarry was trapped. But in his fading consciousness, Malachi smiled, because he could hear something the gunmen couldn't yet. Distant voices calling out in the mountain wind, young voices still alive, still running toward safety. The pressure on his throat increased. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. But just before he lost consciousness completely, he heard something that made his heart leap with impossible hope. The sound of many horses approaching, but these weren't more hunters. The hoof-beats had a different rhythm, a different urgency, and through the cabin's shattered windows he glimpsed something that changed everything. A star pinned to a coat, a real star worn by real lawmen who'd been tracking these false badge-wearing killers across 2 territories. The cavalry had arrived. But were they in time to save anyone or just in time to count the bodies? The big man's grip loosened as shouts erupted outside, orders being barked, men scrambling for position. The hunters had become the hunted, and everything was about to change one final time. Malachi drew one shuddering breath and reached for his knife. This wasn't over. Not yet. The sound of legitimate lawmen surrounding the cabin sent the fake badge-wearers into panic. These men were wanted across multiple territories for murder robbery and worse. Being caught with dead bodies and hunted children would mean the gallows for all of them. The big man, crushing Malachi's throat, suddenly released him, grabbing for his gun instead, but Malachi's knife was already moving, finding the space between ribs that ended the fight permanently. The man collapsed with a look of surprise as if he'd never imagined his victims might fight back effectively. Outside, the real marshal was shouting orders. "Throw down your weapons. You're surrounded." The remaining gunmen had no intention of surrendering. They'd crossed too many lines, committed too many murders. Their only choice was to fight their way out or die trying. Gunfire erupted between the cabin and the surrounding rocks where the lawmen had taken position. Malachi crawled toward the back opening where the children had escaped, his body screaming with pain from the beating he'd taken. Blood ran freely from multiple wounds, but he was alive. More importantly, the children were alive somewhere out there in the mountains. A stray bullet splintered wood near his head as the battle raged. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see the fake lawmen were losing. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position with no real cover. One by one, their return fire grew weaker. The shooting stopped with startling suddenness. In the silence that followed, Malachi could hear nothing but his own labored breathing and the crackle of small fires that had started during the gun battle. Heavy boots approached the cabin entrance. A voice called out gruff but not unkind. "Anyone alive in there?" "Here." Malachi managed his voice barely above a whisper. Marshal Kane stepped through the doorway, his weathered face taking in the carnage with professional detachment. Behind him came 2 deputies, their weapons still drawn but pointed safely downward. "You the one who's been protecting those children?" Kane asked, kneeling beside Malachi to examine his wounds. Malachi nodded, not trusting his voice. The marshal's hands were surprisingly gentle as he checked for serious injuries, the touch of someone who'd seen too much violence and retained his humanity. "Anyway, we've been tracking this gang for months," Kane said as he worked. "They were wanted for killing the children's father and stealing his mining claim documents. When we heard about 6 orphans on the run, we put the pieces together. The map Malachi started. There never was a map," Kane said. "Just a legal deed to a silver mine that would have made those children wealthy. Their father hid it before he died. But these killers convinced themselves it was some kind of treasure map. So the children had been running from death over something they didn't even possess." The cruelty of it made Malachi's chest tighten with renewed anger. "Where are they now?" he asked. Kane smiled, the first genuine warmth Malachi had seen in years. "Safe. My men found them in the caves about an hour ago. The wounded boy is being treated by our medic. Mercy told us everything, how you saved them, how you gave up your own safety to buy them time." Relief flooded through Malachi so powerfully it left him dizzy. They were alive, all 6 of them. Despite everything that had gone wrong, despite his own failures and fears, he'd managed to keep them breathing. "What happens to them now?" he asked. "That depends," Kane said, finishing his examination of Malachi's wounds. "You interested in taking on 6 permanent house guests?" The question hit Malachi like a physical blow. After 3 years of isolation, of swearing never to care about anyone again, the idea of opening his home to 6 children seemed impossible. But as he thought about Mercy's fierce protectiveness, the wounded boy's brave smile, the youngest child's whispered prayers, he realized something had changed inside him. His guilt over failing his own family would never completely disappear. But maybe he could honor their memory by protecting these children who needed him. Now, 3 months later, the sound of laughter echoed across Malachi's ranch for the first time in years. 6 children had transformed his silent house into something resembling a home. Mercy helped with the cooking while keeping the younger ones in line. The boy who'd been wounded had recovered completely and spent his days following Malachi around the ranch, eager to learn everything about horses and cattle. They still had nightmares sometimes. They all did. But they faced them together as a family forged not by blood, but by choice and sacrifice. Malachi never forgot the sound of their prayers that first day when they'd believed they were about to die alone. But now, when he heard them pray before meals, their voices carried gratitude instead of desperation, hope instead of resignation. He'd spent 3 years running from the pain of loss. It took 6 starving children to teach him that sometimes the only way to heal old wounds is to open your heart to new love, no matter how much it might cost. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel now. Click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one with a twist so powerful it will change how you see the frontier forever. Click on the video